All right. Well, Sarah, I think I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over. This is Sarah Lewis from Juneau Cooperative Tribal Extension.
I'm Sarah Lewis. I'm with the University of Alaska Fairbanks Cooperative Extension Service. I serve the Southeast and Kodiak districts. I have decided to do a little bit of a different intro to myself and cooperative extension than I normally do, because I know there's been a lot of stuff in the news recently about universities being financially compelled to remove certain words from websites and all kinds of stuff. And so I, as a University of Alaska Fairbanks professor and cooperative extension service, make sure that everybody knows that the cooperative extension service and all of our staff and faculty, we both include and understand value, including people of all diverse walks of life. And we also make sure that there's equal opportunity for everybody, our courses and learn the skills. And so I'm really pleased that you're all here. I am here from Southeast Alaska. So I live in Tlingit-Ani on the land of the Tlingit people, and I also work on High land and on Sesssion land and on Eyak land and now on Eyak land, which is wonderful. I've expanded along the coastline over time. So, but this is about the homemade foods exemption, and it's going to give some basics. I'm going to be kind of rushing through it. I have Lorinda here as my support, moral and technical. Moral, yeah, support and technical, and so I'm going to. Because of that, there's not going to be a lot of time for questions. We are here all day, so you can ask questions. I will also give contact information at the end, so you can contact me for actually, we can talk for hours. A consultation, you can set it. I like to do that. I've been doing a lot of those. And if you're online, go ahead and type it in. They're going to send those to me, and I will respond to those by email. If someone has a really burning question, give it a try. I'm going to try to kind of zoom through stuff a bit. While we're going through, I'd have some products, maybe they're your products, other products that you're familiar with that you have in mind. Think about, as you're going through this, whether this product and or its ingredients, whether they're allowed by the homemade foods exemption, whether it's a potentially hazardous food or a non-potentially hazardous food. I will explain all of that. Who can sell this product and who can it be sold to? So thinking about those with different products in mind. So we're going to talk about, this is what we're going to talk about. I'm just going to go straight through it. All right. So statutes and regulations. So statutes, so this is new. This is new. There was a new law, HB 251 was signed into law last summer. The process is that statutes then go through the process of the regulations being created and detailed by the agency that needs to implement and enforce that particular statute. And so the DEC website now lists the requirements that must be met for a food business to qualify for the homemade food exemption. But this is where right now I really want to emphasize that this is in a settling in process. So a law is created, it's got all this language, there's statutory intent that sometimes isn't always super clear in the language of the statute. And so at the regulatory level, having to figure out what some of it means, a little bit of back and forth. So there has continued to be, as we get examples that we can sort of bump up against the exemption and see what it means when we get people asking questions about things. There's been some changes, and there may continue to be changes in the regulations and what is put on the website, et cetera, as we go on for the next month. So a bit of grace for me as I potentially give information, and then a couple weeks later, I might need to call back and say, oh, by the way, there's this other thing. So that is the process that we're in right now, but we are at the point where there are requirements that are published on the website by DEC that are to be followed, and that's what I'm basically going to be going through a bunch today. So their information is required for producers to produce and sell food that's made in a home kitchen or in a leased kitchen to be exempt permit. So permitting is for food service, for food manufacture of different types of business and food businesses. This is if this sort of carves out, if you meet certain requirements, do certain things, then you do not need to that licensing nor be inspected. So what I want to talk about right here, and I will talk about it a little bit later, is that there are places in the state where it's a little bit different, and I'll talk about that as well. But this exception, there's homemade food exemptions if you meet certain requirements, if you do certain things. But we like to emphasize that being from DEC food service does not exempt you from other types of permits, like a business license or tax, registering with the tax office in your borough or municipality, things like that. So there are other things, and it doesn't, remove liability. There's other things that you will need to do business. It's just if you meet the requirements, you don't have to get a food service. Local jurisdictions. So this is what I was sort of alluding to. This law allows cities, boroughs, other local jurisdictions to have requirements. And so you need to potentially check your local jurisdiction to see if there are additional requirements. Municipality of Anchorage, for example, regulates all their homemade food businesses within their jurisdiction as cottage foods. That's basically the same process that they've had for 12 plus years. They are continuing that. So Anchorage has their own requirements. If you are going to be selling within Anchorage, you'll need to talk with them about their food, their food laws associated with cottage foods or regulations. Business licenses, tax might be required. Also, sometimes people think in their head about planning and zoning. There are certain cities will have requirements or rules about what type of enterprise or activity can happen in certain parts of their city. And so if you are going to be starting a homemade food business, or if you are going to be distributing it in certain ways, or have a food truck someplace, something like that, you actually do need to talk. You're not exempt from things like planning and zoning. So you need to find out what some of those are and work with your local jurisdiction. Here are some definitions, and I want to say that these are sort of definitions. Help people are not like the definitions that are in the statute. There are very few definitions in the statute to help us out. So homemade foods, products that are produced in home kitchens or uninspected leased kitchens, I'll talk about that a little more, can be sold in Alaska without a food permit or inspection. A home kitchen, this is my definition when I'm talking to folks, generally a residential grade kitchen. Think about what it means to you and what that would mean to a consumer. When a consumer thinks I'm buying a home food, people think what that means, and it's within a private home or residential unit. The laws allow you to lease. It doesn't have to be your owned kitchen. Be a leased kitchen, but it's still a homemade food. So at least of residential quality, but it can be rented temporarily, at least for long-term use, because homemade does mean something to consumers. And it also, even though it is a little bit vague, it actually does mean something within the law and the regulation as well when you're thinking about what kind of kitchen can be produced your food in. About the products that are allowed and not allowed, the levels of food safety or hazard, selling methods, and some information for consumers and users. So allow. This is the big change. Previously, it was only hazardous foods that could be sold as a cottage food. As a homemade food, both hazardous and non-potentially hazardous products sold. Products can contain milk products. Cheesecake, give some examples there. It can contain meat, poultry, and they can contain processed fruits and vegetables. Not allowed. Milk and milk products, milk that are made directly from milk, not ingredient in other recipes, are not allowed to be sold as a homemade food. Those are regulated under, those have different regulations, and so that's not part of this exemption. Game and non-amenable species, not allowed to be sold as a cottage food or as an ingredient in a cottage food. Again, different regulations. Seafood and fish, different regulations. Oils rendered from game animal fat and controlled substances. So, you know, no special are going to be allowed through cottage foods. So these are things that are not allowed in your cottage food or food products. Then there are some other things that some of them sort of fall a little bit or don't fall under. They don't fall under the homemade food exemption. They're under other things. So poultry and poultry products, they're a different exemption. Raw milk is regulated under the Office of the State. Raw honey, there are other exemptions in the Alaska Food Code about that. Raw produce, that is also, there are different exemptions about that aren't part of the home exemption. And then non-edible cosmetics. I actually get a fair number of questions from folks who are non-edible ingredients in them. And so those are not something that fall under these regulation exemptions. Levels of safety, also sort of the potential is the two categories. Potentially hazardous are those that don't require time or temperature control to be safe to eat. Low risk, generally there's a low risk of harmful bacteria contamination. I'll talk a little bit more about what potentially hazardous foods are put in a separate category because safety is time limited or requires some sort of temperature control to be safe, because the higher risk of harmful bacterial contamination. There's two categories, and this is very important to consider with your products that you might want to sell food, because there are different requirements for selling based on what type of are making an offering. So here's non-potentially hazardous foods. In all of the classes of food preservation and food safety and stuff, I use these two graphics all the time. This is a pH scale. 0's at the top, strong acid, 14 at the bottom, strong alkali. Neutral is 7, and pretty much everything we eat is technically acidic. But there's a very important line at 4.6. So a pH of 4.6 is important because that divides what kind of environments microorganisms like to live in. So high acid foods, those that are between approximately 2 and 4.5, those are foods that molds and yeasts. So molds and yeasts grow in those foods. Those are not universally harmful to humans. There are people with allergies, sensitive, gross, they spoil your food, but they are not necessarily universally harmful, but high acid environments are what molds and yeasts will move into. Low acid foods, that's why we get into low acid foods, you're likely to be looking at something that may be potentially hazardous because of the higher risk of bacterial contamination, harmful bacterial contamination. And so non-potentially hazardous foods includes so naturally high acid foods are your berries, obviously your citrus, fruit. The fruit that we kind of think of in our heads as vegetables actually are low acid. They actually behave like vegetables. They've been lying to us all this time. And so they are actually low, like zucchini and squash and things like that. They are low acid foods, but most food, and then I'll talk about low acid food in a second. All of berries, all of our edible wild berries are high acid foods rather. And so jams, jellies, conserves, things that are made with those berries, pickled vegetables. So vegetables. Oh.
So maybe just hold a standard distance and try that.
Was I? Okay. All right. Okay. I'll spit on it. Okay. So vegetables are actually, most vegetables with the exception of rhubarb, which I like to Now, rhubarb is a high acid vegetable, but most vegetables are low acid foods. But if you add acid to them, if you pickle them, so your sauerkraut, your vinegar pickles, etc., they can become a high acid food. So pickled vegetables are can be a non-potentially hazardous food. Baked goods and pastries, as long as they don't have sort of dairy-based frostings and fillings, stuff like that. So lots of baked goods and pastries are non-potentially hazardous. Candies and confections, dried fruits, vegetables, and herbs, even though vegetables are low acid, they are very, very easy to dry, to dehydrate, and so they become low water activity. So that's another factor associated with whether something is non-potentially hazardous. So this is a scale for water activity, which is not the same as moisture content or water content. It has to do with how available the water molecules are for microorganisms to live on. And so the more you dehydrate something, there are other factors. The more you dehydrate something, the lower the water activity is. And then you can see that, let's see, maybe I have, never mind. You can see that the green is where, kind of like over there, the molds, yeasts, and bacteria. The green is where mold, yeast, bacteria. And so things that are below where there will be microbial growth, those have a low enough water activity, and dried herbs and vegetables and dried fruit are right on the edge there, but they are also typically low enough water activity to be non-potentially hazardous. And also adding in freeze drying to that potentially as well. That's a new and exciting thing that folks are doing. So potentially hazardous foods, low acidity and high water activity. So potentially hazardous foods are those that contain milk, milk products, cheese, meat, poultry, meat, most vegetables. There are some fruits, like I mentioned. Fruit juices are potentially a hazardous food because there's a lot of water added to those. And water, if we look at so water is right there at neutral. So water itself is low acid. And so even if you take something that's high acid, just like if you take vegetables and add an acid, if you take something that's high acid and add something that is low acid, eventually you get to the point where it's going to be low enough acid to be potentially hazardous. And things that have high water activity, and so therefore are more likely to harbor harmful bacteria. So you've got dried meat, fish, beans, cured sausage. So when you're talking about dehydrating, meat and fish will still potentially be in the high water activity category, and definitely fresh meat and fish as well. And so the more water activity, the more risk of bacterial contamination. Okay, so how to determine the level of food safety hazard with your food that you are producing? Are we doing okay with the sound thing? Okay. So there's a couple of different ways. So for pH, you can do pH tests. You can buy a digital pH meter. That's what I tend to recommend for folks who are going to be doing pickles, barbecue sauces, acidified foods, because they often like to mess with them and change the ingredients, and you might have to test them pretty regularly to see where you're at and the pH. And a digital pH meter is the best way to do that. Every once in a while, pH test strips, but they don't give you a number, and you do kind of need a number. But if you've had an actual number associated with your product, then you can kind of test it periodically with the test strips to make sure that it's still definitely within the range that you're thinking. There's also the state lab in Anchorage. They will do pH tests. And there are also previously tested recipes. So the Cooperative Extension, all of our recipes that are for canning, pickling and canning, those are all recipes that have been scientifically tested. So if you follow those recipes, you're very likely, unless you do some significant change, you're going to be within the parameters of those tested recipes. Water activity tests, that's a little bit more difficult. The equipment to do that is expensive. It's little, but it's mighty and expensive. And we do have a couple in the state lab in Anchorage. There's actually one here in Kodiak. They do product testing in Kodiak, which is awesome. And we're hoping to be able to do more of that in the future. Again, some previously tested recipes. If you're following USDA or extension recipes for dehydrating things, and you'll be using something that is both time and laboratory tested. But this is important. This is on the food producer to figure out what this is. And it's important to do that because if you don't know whether you have potentially hazardous or non-potentially hazardous, then you're not going to know how you're supposed to be selling it. So this is the responsibility of the food producer to figure out what type of food you have. Because as I said, the selling methods, the methods, locations, and requirements are different for the two. So non-potentially hazardous foods, I have a pointer, how exciting, can be either direct to consumer or through an agent or third party. There are requirements to display homemade foods separately from inspected foods, if that's going to be the situation that it's in. For both types, online and mail order sales are okay, but they can only be sold in Alaska. They cannot be sold interstate. And there's no limit on sales or volume. That's one of the things that was a big change from the previous Cottage Foods, is that there was a sort of a cap of how much you could make each year. Now there isn't that. You can please make lots of money, get a product that people love. And so with non-potentially hazardous foods, you do have some flexibility. I'll talk a little bit about agent and third party in a second. Potentially hazardous foods, though, can be direct to consumer by the producer only. Again, displays are separate from anything. They have to be separate both from non-potentially hazardous foods. So if you're doing both, they need to be separate. And then also, they need to be also separate from any inspected foods if there's a situation where you have some inspected foods. I don't know. If you've got inspected foods, you're most likely going to be able to sell, your potentially hazardous foods. But there are potentially situations. So they need to be displayed separately. It's about consumer information, which I'll talk about in a second. It's about making sure that the consumer knows that, and it's clear to them visually, as well as the information they get, that they are not getting a food that has been inspected according to things that they might think would be required through inspection. Kitchens, knowledge of the producer, things like that. So the consumers getting as much information as possible so they know the difference between homemade foods and inspected foods is important. All right, so sales through an agent or third party is for non-potentially hazardous foods only. And the producer has a business arrangement with an agent of the producer or a third-party vendor who can sell the food to the consumer. It's not required, but it's highly recommended that there be a written agreement between the producer and the agent or third-party vendor, because the agent or third-party vendor also needs to follow the homemade foods requirements in terms of display, etc. So if you are a producer and you are selling through a third party or an agent, and if they do something wrong, your food is suddenly not actually qualifying as a homemade food that is exempt. Because if they're starting to do something that bumps it into something that would need to be more regulated and inspected, then you're no longer a homemade food producer. So you need to make sure that both sides understand the requirements. And so that's what this says down here. Both must follow all the homemade foods requirements to maintain that exemption. And also it helps maintain an exemption from other retail commerce requirements. So there are words that are very important that have to do with types of commerce, selling of things, wholesale, retail, and consignment sales. If you are producing food under the homemade food requirements and you are following all of those requirements, you're just going to have a business arrangement. It could be that you are selling a lot of your food to somebody. It could be in bulk. It could be that they are going to resell. You might be selling to a cafe and then they resell your product. That's your business arrangement. It could be that you give it to them and every time they sell it, you get 20% or whatever it is. Hopefully more than that. work on your arrangement. But that is your business arrangement. And as long as both of you are following the homemade foods requirements, you're good to go. Okay. Pop quiz. Well, how are we doing time-wise? Normally this is like an hour to an hour and a half, and I've got 5 minutes left. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of a pop quiz. We might go through it relatively fast, but I'm going to show you some food products. You are going to think and maybe holler out if you want to. We'll do it quickly. Is the food that you're seeing allowed under the homemade food exemption? Is it potentially hazardous or non-potentially hazardous? And we don't have to be done exactly in 5 minutes because I'm doing the next one too. So I'll just go over a little bit. And can the food be sold through an agent or third party, or does it have to be sold directly by the producer? So let's start. What do y'all think? These are dehydrated, I think freeze-dried bananas. They qualify as a homemade food. Yep. The ingredients and the way you've done them are, what are the other questions? Non-potentially hazardous. Could be sold by, yep, there we go. I think, that looks like a veggie burger, but I don't know, you can, right? I know, it's a good picture. Boom, assuming there's no fish in it. Sometimes you can, but doesn't look like there. Okay. So I think to yourself, this is probably kombucha. So it does qualify, but kombucha can sometimes be a high acid and sometimes be on the edge and sometimes be low acid. So it's your responsibility to figure out what your product is. What's that? I know. Yes. And then how you sell it depends on the answer to number 2. So there are some things that you're going to have to figure it out. Pickles are another one. Things that are acidified. Oh, this one didn't, I clicked it twice. So, but baked goods. It went backwards. Okay. It was a freebie. There you go. But baked goods, bread qualifies. Non-potentially hazardous can be sold by producer, agent, or third party. Vegetable soup. Ding, 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 ding. Yeah, can be directly sold by producer only. Let's see. Okay. Cheesecake. This is cheesecake. There you go. Cookies. Some of these are qualifies. These are non-potentially hazardous, can be sold by a third party. Little shrimpies, little shrimp scampi here. Correct. Does not qualify for the homemade foods exemption. It's got separately regulated ingredients. Yes. Chopped salad. Yes. Yep, there you go. It's a potentially hazardous product because of the vegetables, jams and jellies. These qualify for Cottage Foods or so non-potentially hazardous, third party. Okay. Oh, look at this one. Look at this one. So that's a pressure canner. That don't know, that's a pressure canner, and someone has already canned some green beans and is preparing to can some green beans. This is kind of there's still a little bit of movement on this one, maybe, because vegetables, processed vegetables or heat treated vegetables are considered potentially hazardous, but once they are canned, if you do it correctly, they're technically shelf stable. So they don't require time or temperature control after that, but they're still vegetables that are being processed. So I, as a cooperative extension agent who am constantly teaching classes about, please pressure can your low acid foods if you're going to do them in jars because of the risk of a very specific bacteria. I'll be talking, this is also a teaser for the next section, which is about food safety for preserved foods. But because of the risk of botulism, if you do it incorrectly, it has a little special bonus risk. But so it's at this point, it qualifies for the homemade food exemption, potentially hazardous. There's some little question there. But if you consider it potentially hazardous, which I personally do, I personally consider this to be potentially hazardous, and I teach classes on it all the time. It can only be directly sold by the producer. And yeah, stick around, but producer and consumer, be aware about this one, and stay for the next class as well. Consumer information, display, signage, labeling. This is what I was talking about in terms of informing the producer so that they know that your food is different from an inspected food. Your homemade food is different. They can't be displayed together. There needs to be prominent signage if you're at a market or you have a food truck, whatever it is. There's a specific clear and prominent label that needs to be if there's going to be labels on things. So unpackaged foods that might not have labels, there needs to be, you need to inform the consumer. It doesn't necessarily say how, but typically signage and labels is going to be the best. You are required to put the producer's name, current address, telephone number, and business license number if you are selling a homemade food. And packaged foods, again, clear and prominent, but they actually have to have a label with the statement, which I think I actually have wrong here. I'm not sure. Oops, nope, back. I apologize. So the statement is on the website. The required statement is on the website. And I think there's a little bit more to it that has to do with meat, but there has to be that statement. Again, producer's name, current address, telephone number, and business license number. And best practices and risk management. These are not necessarily things, these are not things that are required by the homemade food exemption, but if you are going to be starting up a homemade food business, especially if you are going to be doing a potentially hazardous food, then you should keep your formulation or recipe on file for each of your products so that, including if it's an acidified food, including the pH, if it's a dehydrated food, seeing if you can get the water activity for that. So keeping that on file, drafting a formal agreement with any third parties that are selling your non-potentially hazardous foods, cleaning and sanitizing best practices. I highly recommend folks either get a food handler's card or if you're doing potentially hazardous food, actually become a certified food protection manager, which is actually a course or reading a book and taking an exam. Liability insurance. You're a business that can potentially, and you have a product, especially if it's potentially hazardous, that could make someone sick. This is, your home business. Who knows what you could lose if someone were to get sick or even just think that they got sick from your food, because that's something I was talking about with someone recently that knows a lot about such things, was that a lot of times people will think the most recent thing they ate is what made them sick, but often it's something, a day or before. But what if your food was the last thing that they ate? And right now, really if you want to call it the sort of the police, the police of this, the people who are going to be looking into it is the community. It's consumers in the community. These are if you are following all of the requirements for homemade food, you are not going to be regulated. You're not going to be inspected. The DEC, if there is an outbreak of sickness, they do have the ability to come and check into that. But it tends to be more likely that it's going to be somebody in your community that complains or ruins your reputation online. There's all kinds of different things that can happen. So people need to be aware of those risks when they're doing a homemade food business. And then contact me with questions or for a consultation if you have questions about products, etc. Here are resources. DEC homemade food website is going to continue right now to be the go-to. I do, like I said, I do consultations, and you can just contact these with questions. The Small Business Development Center, when you start looking at liability and other starting a business, they're going to be your go-to. And Alaska Manufacturing Extension Partnership are going to be great, especially if you are going to be increasing or increasing your market, or wanting to start to sell online, or wanting to get into the inspected food business, then talking with MEP is a great idea. And then there you go. This is me. I answer lots of questions, and I actually have a little thing now because I've been getting so many calls. You can actually schedule a consultation. You don't even have to talk to me before you schedule a consultation. Just tell me what you're wanting to talk about and we'll schedule it. And so that's this. That's the end of this one. So while they're switching over, could probably maybe take a couple of questions. I don't know how long it'll take to switch to the next. Yes, Brad. It is, so this is me talking as someone who knows a fair amount about buildings. Home kitchens, you think about the consumer's expectation of what a home kitchen would be. It would be something that is in a building that has been approved for someone to live in. So it has met the codes for a home kitchen, which there are codes for home kitchens that may include a little bit of ventilation, but not necessarily ventilation that's specific to a certain type of food, right? And there is going to need to be potentially plumbing for that city, so if that, but no, no, correct, right, yeah. If their municipality allows them to live in that home, like actively allows them to live in that home, then yeah. Yeah.
How separate? Be on the same table with a divider? Like, is there any
There isn't, and that's the thing, that as these things are, oh, I'm so sorry. I totally didn't do exactly what you told me to do. We both,
Yeah, so
yeah.
questions were, if there
Uh-oh.
regulation on the type of kitchen, home kitchen, and
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and repeat it because this one seems to work better. No, it's totally cool. So the first question was whether there's any regulations on the home kitchens and et cetera. And so you heard my response to that, but it was about there really isn't any definition associated with that that's formal. I don't think anything, yeah. Yes. And if it's privately owned, but it's owned by someone else and you're leasing it, there is still the expectation that that kitchen that you're leasing is actually a kitchen and it meets the building codes for whatever that particular building is in, but at the very least, the same that a residential kitchen would meet. Oh, the separation. That's right. The next question was separation. There it is. It's not delineated. It's just, it needs to be clear to the consumer that there are inspected foods and uninspected foods. I believe if there is refrigeration involved and things like that, then there might need to be a different. Even, okay. Okay.
That's more for like the commercial.
No.
Yeah, that's more like if it's a market that's permitted by DEC, that they would need to keep that, and they owned it. Maybe they own that market, they would need to keep it completely separate. Okay, the question was about hazardous. You can have those products together. So this is Lorinda from DEC talking. I'm helping Sarah, but
because it's got, yeah, no, exactly. Right. So it can't be their agent or their third party who is selling. Yeah. And therefore, if you're going to be mixing them, you're going to have to be the producer, not an agent or a third party. there was a question over here.
Karen, do you have to actually live in the kitchen, or does somebody have to live in the kitchen, or could it just be?
You can lease a kitchen. You can lease a kitchen that is in a different building as well. It could be a church kitchen, you know, or something like that. Yep. Or community kitchen.
Kelly, the other thing that's come up, like maybe you own a mobile food unit that you own and you want to produce, because we had that with cottage food. You could use that mobile food unit to produce food under this exemption also.
Yes. Great. Oh, thank you. Yes. So what about wild harvest vegetables, et cetera, not game? So medicinals are different. So those are different than food. So that's one thing. But if you're going to eat them, then when it gets into medicinal, I shut down. Call it food. If it's going to be then call it food. And if you're going to call it a medicine, you got to follow. Yeah, right. Food is medicine, but medicine is not always food. And so if you're going to call it medicine, there's other regulations, you know, like what you're saying it's doing, et cetera, that are going to be different. But and so that's, yeah, there's FDA stuff that gets in on that. But if you are, you know, if you are doing, yeah, oh yes, exactly. Or pickled beach asparagus, huge in Southeast, you know, kelp pickles, things like that. Wild product is just the same as if you were getting, yep, you're just talking about potentially hazardous, non-potentially hazardous. And then there are also things about where you're harvesting it from, you know, and if there's regulations about who owns that land, et cetera. But okay, next one. $33. All right, here we go. All right. Food preservation safety for local food leaders. I do this one a lot now because a lot of people, I mean, people are doing markets. People are doing all of our small communities in Southeast. People are doing all kinds of food preserving, obviously have been doing it for years. And sometimes people are interested in it, which is why these two presentations kind of go well together. But having more people in our Alaskan communities who are knowledgeable about some of the specific food safety preserves, what we were talking about previously had a little bit of preserved foods in it, but also was prepared foods. But specifically with preserved foods, wanting people to know some of the specific food safety considerations. So very briefly, because general kitchen sanitation, just like I talked about in the one with best practices, I'll talk about that a little bit. And this is kind of designed, of course, for the information for someone who might use it for themselves, but really this is about getting this information to people who are potentially going to teach others in some way. Either they are an educator or they are part of the food sovereignty group with their tribe, or if they're one of the 10 people in the community that does everything. We've got a lot of those in Southeast, you know, so the person that everybody comes to with the questions about food. So safety concerns about specific safety concerns, Clostridium botulinum and other bacteria, pH and water activity, low oxygen packaging, some risks to understand and avoid, and a few little FAQs and resources at the end. Again, for those who have joined, pretty short time frame. So I'll try to take a few. We do have a breaks at the end, so I can take a few questions at the end. Otherwise, I'll be around the rest of the day. And if there's any questions online, I can do those by email. Kitchen sanitation. The point of cleaning and sanitizing your kitchen is to reduce or eliminate bacterial contamination. And we've heard about most of the bacteria that we're worried about generally in a kitchen, E. coli, salmonella, et cetera. Other terms like the danger zone. The danger zone is a temperature range from 40 to 100. That is if food is in that, if potentially hazardous food, specifically if you were in the last presentation, is in that danger zone, that's the temperature range that bacteria like and can start to grow and reproduce in. A step is when you do something to kill all the microorganisms. They come back, but there's that baseline of you full step. So those are some terms to understand when it comes to bacteria in the kitchen, keeping things out of the danger zone. So either keeping them cold or keeping them hot, knowing the appropriate kill step, if that's what's required, et cetera. And also knowing that there are 2 steps to cleaning and sanitizing. Is not necessarily sanitizing, and sanitizing is not necessarily cleaning. You need to clean first and sanitize. There are different chemicals that get used for that. They do different things. I'm not going to go into that in depth here, but that's something that I definitely talk with folks about a lot when it comes to kitchen sanitation. All right, so here are some of the biggies in food preservation that we're concerned about. Botulism, Clostridium botulinum is the big one. It is a very dangerous neurotoxin. Where, in Alaska, actually, we are fortunate, if you will, in having had, and so even small clinics and small communities know how to diagnose it, know what to do about it pretty quickly. It's also PSP is another one that we deal with a lot, which is a neurotoxin. So we tend to know about Clostridium botulinum and how to deal with the sickness that comes from it. And of course, there's other bacteria that we tend to be more familiar with. Are the ones that we think about as pathogenic bacteria that make us, food poisoning type stuff. So we're worried about both of these categories of bacteria, different risks of them associated with different types of preserving. So pH scale, I talked about this a little bit in the last class, but this is an important one. So 0 is at the top, strong acid, 14 is at the bottom, strong alkali, 7 neutral, which is pure water, is right here. Pretty much all of the food we eat is technically acidic, but there are 2 categories. There's high acid foods and there's low acid foods. Let me actually do this. I think I did fancy things. That's right. So 4.6 is the line there that we are concerned about. And high acid foods, most fruit, all berries, rhubarb, those are naturally high acid foods. Then you get to tomatoes. They're a funny little category. They are a fruit, but they behave closer to their vegetable cousins in that they are right on the edge in terms of their acidity. So tomatoes, if you have a recipe that you're going to be canning that has tomatoes in it, the recipe is going to include a little bit of acid. It's not like you're pickling them, but it'll include a little bit of vinegar or acetic acid to bump it to make sure that it's high enough acid to be in the high acid category if you're going to be canning it. Low acid foods are most vegetables. That rhubarb is an exception, and all animal products, and that is oil, skin, meat, eggs, milk. All animal products are naturally low acid foods, and most vegetables are low acid foods. Pickled vegetables are a 4th category. That is when you take vegetables and you acidify them by adding either vinegar or you ferment them in salt to create lactic acid and lactofermentation. So those become pickles and they are a high acid food. So these are the categories: high acid foods and low acid foods. And oops, did I have something else add and I didn't see what it was? There we go. Okay, yeast and mold. Maybe I missed that. So what you're worried about in high acid foods, that's an environment that yeasts and molds will live in, continue to live, continue to thrive, live their best lives. They'll be in high acid. And yeasts and molds, as I mentioned before, are not universally harmful to humans. They're spoilage. There are people with allergies and sensitivities, etc. But we are not as concerned about those. We're more concerned about those with waste and yuck and, people have allergies. It's bacteria that we're concerned about because there are bacteria that are universally harmful to humans. The ones listed there, I've mentioned a little bit already, but bacteria likes this low acid environment. And so that's why this line right here is important, because it lets you know what else is going to move into your food and make it potentially dangerous or just spoil it. So, and then under that bacteria, when in a very specific situation, when you put a low acid food into a low oxygen environment, the bacteria that you are especially concerned about is Clostridium botulinum. So, and so when you are canning something, part of the canning process, there's kind of two wonderful things that happen during it. One is that you are doing a kill step. I mentioned that before. You're doing a kill step. You're hoping to kill whatever might be in there. But the other thing that you're doing is our jars in America have been designed specifically to, during the canning process, to remove air from that jar so that the lid can vacuum seal down so that it seals the jar so nothing new moves in. What you've done is you've created a low oxygen environment in those jars. And so that's why I point that out. 212 degrees boiling water temperature, actually sometimes even lower than that, but you don't have to have a scale to see, or to have a thermometer to see that water is boiling. So they're definitely killed at 212 degrees. Most of your bacteria and your yeast and molds will be pasteurized at boiling water temperatures. Unfortunately, Clostridium botulinum is all around us, but so it, lives in oxygen, but it does not, gets into a low oxygen environment. The live Clostridium botulinum can be killed at lower temperatures, but botulism spores are very hardy. They're like an egg, sort of. Actually, if I went back to the pictures of the bacteria, I could kind of point it out to you. The botulism spore is very hardy, and it does not matter how long you boil it at 212 degrees, it won't be killed. It doesn't matter how long you boil water, it will not go above 212 degrees unless you add pressure. To kill botulism spores, you must get to 204 degrees Fahrenheit, and the only way to do that is to add pressure. So low acid foods that are in jars or other low oxygen environment need to be, jars especially, need to be processed at 240 in a pressure canner to make sure that you're actually killing the botulism spores. Then drying, dehydration and drying, reducing water activity. Some of you will have seen this little one before in the earlier thing, but water activity is different from moisture content or water content. It is about how available water molecules are for use by microorganisms for them to live. And so again, we've got a scale. Okay, there we go. 0 bone dry, 1 is pure water. I've got these lines here. Let me go back one just so it's not in the way. I've got these lines here. So this is the point at which some microbial growth will start. And this is the line at which it's specifically going to be bacteria, needs that level of water activity to grow. And so this zone in between, typically when we're talking about something that is truly shelf stable and non-potentially hazardous, we're going to be talking about something that is at that line or below it, because even though you'll see that there's dried meat, fish, and beans is in this zone here, so it's at about the level when mold can start. Jerky and smoked fish are not, even though we think of them as being, and they do have a level of drying associated with them, the differentiation between dried meat fish and jerky and smoked fish is that dried meat and fish, you really do need to rehydrate for it to be palatable. Whereas jerky and smoked fish, that's, snack on it, that's ready to eat. It's you don't have to rehydrate it to make it edible or palatable. So there is a difference between those. And so you can see that it's actually on this scale, it's not a small difference either. And so dried meat and fish can eventually mold. And if they start to mold, their water activity increases. They start to create a new environment and they start moving up that scale. So that's why in the last presentation, considering meats, even if they are dehydrated, you would consider them potentially hazardous because of their proximity when it comes to water activity to being able to harbor bacteria. You had a question? No, it's not percentage. This is the scale that is used for water activity. So it's 0 and 1. And then the scale, so 0.4 water activity. No, this is the thing that I talked about it briefly in the last class, that if you needed to get a water activity test, here in Kodiak, you can get one done at the Seafood Center, and you can also get one done at the state lab in Anchorage. Yeah, because it's a specialized piece of equipment. There's not a whole lot of things that you need to get a water activity test for, but there are, as we are getting into potentially hazardous foods, there might be some more that you should get a water activity test for. Yes. Oh, yes. So one of the things with water activities, this seems pretty clear cut here, right? I mean, you've got your dried foods, you're lowering the water activity, but water activity also has to do with, so those water molecules might be interacting with other things. So you don't think to yourself as jams and jellies as being low water, or syrups, things like that. But the water is bound with acids, is bound with sugar. And so sugar and acid and dehydration and all of those things will work either together or separately in different foods to reduce their potential hazard, their risk to bacterial contamination. Is that where you wanted me to go? Good enough? Okay. So those are the two things that we talk about a lot in food preservation, because as you can see, obviously we do a lot of drying and smoking and all kinds of things throughout Alaska for preserving our food. So this is important to know that when you get up to this area, the bacterial growth associated with that. And of course, when you're canning things and putting them into low oxygen, we do a lot of that with canning. And when we do vacuum bags and things like that, when we're putting things into freezers, those are also low oxygen containers. So I talked about those. All right. So now we're getting into how we're doing. What's the time? 45. Okay. So I'm going to start talking about some specific risks and what you are at risk of. So low acid foods in low oxygen packaging. I talked about that a little bit when it comes to canning, but there are other things. If there's going to be a vacuum seal of some sort, that's going to be a low oxygen environment inside that container. And so we have bags, jars, and other types of plastic containers where we remove oxygen. So low acid foods in low oxygen packaging is a botulism risk. The one that we don't think about logically all the time, but just because we don't know, is that jerky and that smoked salmon. If you're going to freeze that and you're going to freeze it in low oxygen packaging, we often think to ourselves that jerky and smoked salmon are, to a certain extent, sort of safe on the counter. I mean, we take it camping with us. There's a reason we do that. There is a level of preservation, short-term preservation. And so we think to ourselves, it's okay to leave that out on the counter. So, but you know that you don't want to leave it out on the counter all winter, so you freeze it. You put it into a vacuum seal bag because that does great things for getting oxygen out. Oxygen will cause, freezer burn, et cetera. So you want to get rid of some of that oxygen. What happens that you need to be aware of, and that in your communities and folks you talk to, is if you have a low acid food like jerky or smoked salmon and it's in one of the vacuum seal bag and you take it out of the freezer, you're getting ready to go on a fishing trip, whatever it is, you take it out of the freezer, people think to themselves, well, that's shelf stable. We can buy this from the store and you can just put it in your backpack, and they don't open that bag. So there is a risk when you've got your low oxygen packaging. So all you have to do is open it, allow oxygen in, open that up. You can put it into a different container. You can wrap it up. You can put a clip on it, whatever you want to do, but open that container up so that it is no longer low oxygen. Once you take that out of the freezer, open it to let it thaw, and then do with it what you want to with your jerky or smoked salmon. Jars, I talked about that when it comes to canning. So all of those are potential risks for botulism growth if you do not treat them properly, either by pasteurizing at 240 or at adding oxygen back in if it's a sealed container. Pressure canning mistakes and misunderstandings. So here's a risk: incorrect directions. You're using the wrong canning method. So maybe you are doing, a vegetable that you have not pickled and you're water bath canning it. You're not getting it up to 240. And that's because someone told you it's okay to water bath can that particular thing. And so you do that. The wrong pressure. So if you are pressure canning it, but you're using an old recipe that was before there had been enough testing or something like that, which happens a lot because the changes don't happen to the tested recipes for pressure canning. They don't change really rapidly, and they stick around. The directions stick around in aunties and grandma's minds and your own mind for years, or the papers are there extension from years ago, et cetera. So you might use the wrong pressure. You might use the wrong canning time, because the tested recipes for canning are what is happening in those tested recipes is that in a lab, they are determining that product, that specific product, is getting hot enough for long enough all the way through in that specific jar size to kill what you want to kill. And in a jar, you want to be killing Clostridium botulinum spores. And so the wrong canning time or the wrong jar sizes can both affect whether or not you're actually killing what you need to kill in that jar. And then untested recipes, just recipes that you get from a random blog and you don't check it against a USDA or an extension recipe to see if it's any good. So untested recipes, those are all risks. Incorrect use of canners, and I'm talking about pressure canners here. If your dial gauge is inaccurate and that is your gauge that you're using, two things, or one thing that a lot of people do, because it's okay to do it in a pressure cooker. So I'll talk about that in a second. Hopefully I'll get to that. In pressure cookers, the old stovetop pressure cookers, they used to say, put it in a cold bath of water to cool it down quickly or release the pressure. You do not want to reduce your cool down time when you're pressure canning. The tested times for pressure canning include the warm-up period, the canning period at the appropriate temperature and pressure, and the cool down. As much as 50% of the microbial die-off can happen during that cool down time. So if you release pressure to cool that canner down quickly, or if you do something else to cool that canner down, you are actually reducing the canning time. So that goes back to wrong canning time. So you do not want to reduce that cool down time no matter how tempted you are, because it's very late and you want to go to bed. Don't reduce that cool down time. Using the wrong pressure gauge. And what I mean by that is pressure canners will have either or a dial gauge that has numbers on it, or they will have a weighted gauge that actually rocks and is also a pressure regulator, because it rocks by releasing steam, and that keeps the canner at a certain pressure. But if you are using a recipe that gives, that is telling you to do it 11 pounds on a dial gauge canner or 10 pounds on a weighted gauge canner, but you're using a dial gauge canner and you use it at 10 pounds, then you're actually under processing. So paying attention to and knowing about how to use your canner, what kind of gauge you have, how it works, to show you that it is reaching the correct temperature. Using the wrong equipment. So this is a big one, using a pressure cooker instead of a pressure canner. So this is one in the last few years, the last decade or so, I've really been hammering home to people, because it wasn't a problem as much, or maybe at all, until we all bought Instant Pots. I have two. They have names. I love them. They're awesome. They are not pressure canners. They are pressure cookers. Instant Pot actually came out with a model that says canning. It has a canning button. It is not. It was not tested for canning. So that has been very confusing to people now that we have both of them in our houses on a regular basis. A pressure cooker is only designed to get things to a hot temperature. You don't even know what it is. You don't know what the pressure is necessarily to do it quickly. Pressure canners are designed to keep it at that temperature, and you know that it keeps it at that temperature. So pressure canners will have some way of letting you know what pressure it's at, what temperature it's at, and that it's maintaining it. Pressure cookers will not. Also, pressure canners are a specific size. If you cannot fit 4 1-quart size jars into what you think is a pressure canner, if it's not tall enough, you can't get the lid on. If it's not, doesn't have the diameter, you can't get the jars in. That is a pressure cooker. It must be able to hold 4 1-quart size jars to be a pressure canner. Yes. There is only one that has been fully tested. Thank you. What about those electric pressure canners? Well, there is only one in the US that has actually been tested for that purpose, and it is the Presto Precise. I have one. I like it, but it has not actually been fully approved, to be honest. And unfortunately, there are some, I just always warn anybody who's going to be buying canning stuff online, don't do it through Amazon unless you go to the little, you know how to go to the thing to find out the source where it's coming from. Because unfortunately what happened is there are a few electric pressure canners that aren't really, that started coming into our market during the pandemic. There's some other products that are also related to canning that you want to be careful about as well, but they're not as important as that one. So there is one. And so keep your eyes open for that. And hopefully that will get, as time goes on, it'll actually have the appropriate testing so that Cooperative Extension can say, yes, go ahead and use that. I have one, but I actually don't use it nearly as often. It's very small. We do big canning in Alaska, right? We do big batches. And it's very small. You can do like a little batch of soup or something like that. A couple, 4 quarts of soup is what you can do. But yes, good question. And then if you're using a water bath canner instead of a pressure canner, just know it, no matter how long you boil water, as I said, in a water bath canner that doesn't have pressure, it's not going to get above 212 degrees. And you can keep that going for 8 hours. You can keep that going for 12 hours. It's not going to get hot enough to kill botulism spores. You must use a pressure canner to do that. And it's a lot less time. So all of those are potential botulism risks. Other risks with low acid foods. So, and I talked about the dried meat or fish in low oxygen packaging. It must be frozen and open the package when you're thawing. Fermenting seafood, only use traditional methods and indigenous knowledge for that. And that's coming tricky as well because of climate change. And so the botulism outbreaks that have happened in Alaska have almost entirely, with one exception that I know about, been associated with traditional methods being, or traditional preservation fermentation methods being done in a non-traditional way, using plastic instead of natural materials, doing it in the wrong season, doing it at the wrong temperature, things like that. So for fermenting seafood, traditional methods and indigenous knowledge is super important. Low acid foods stored in oil. So that can be garlic, meat, fish, and herbs. So this is one thing that they kind of know about in commercial kitchens, is that garlic actually, it has a higher botulism risk when it's stored in oil. So oil actually creates a low oxygen environment right around each piece of low acid food. And so you got your garlic pieces, or if you have meat in oil, fish in oil, salad dressing, herbs in oil, just recognize that you want those to be short-term refrigerated, because low acid food stored in oil is also a potential botulism risk. And so do small batches of those and be careful with those as well. Risks when fermenting vegetables. So I do a lot of classes on fermented vegetables, fermenting pickles, and there's really only one risk. It's a super safe pickling process. Lots of different vegetables, all of them. You can pickle almost anything, pickle your shoe, whatever. But the thing with food is that if you get, it's the salinity that is actually creating an environment. It's the salt that's creating an environment that inhibits unfriendly bacterial growth. It's the environment that, 5 minutes, it's the environment, the helpful microorganisms, the lactobacillus, et cetera, but if you get below a 2.25 salinity, it's actually, there is listeria. I don't have it listed here yet, but if you get below that 2.25, so if you are a person who's doing fermented vegetables, do pay attention to the amount of salinity. And typically it doesn't work super well unless you're in very controlled conditions. You're not, it's going to mold or get stinky. It's not going to do its job anyways under normal home fermentation circumstances. You typically want between 3 and 5% for it to actually work. So, but don't reduce the salinity because you have a low salt diet or something like that, because you can get to the point where the salinity is too low and it becomes a risk. And then of course, poor kitchen sanitation. These are things that, that's probably E. coli. Nope, that's E. coli. Something is over there. Something dangerous. So, etc. Very dangerous, etc. Yes. Grammatarians would say that's terrible too. Okay, E. coli, salmonella, listeria. So these are the risks. Botulism is not necessarily the risk when you're fermenting vegetables. It's your general kitchen stuff, because you're not talking about a low oxygen environment. You're talking about high salinity, things like that. So, and eventually high acid. Oh, there we go. Oh, is that it? Or did I go just way too far? Yes, I did. Okay, I kept it going. Okay, that was fermented vegetables. That's right. Okay. So if you are a local food leader, you're going to get lots of questions about stuff. So is it okay to can this ingredient, vegetable soup, recipe, etc.? So really good resources. My favorite resource is the National Center for Home Food Preservation. So that is that's the national repository of all the tested canning recipes. And extension faculty, HHFD faculty, there are 2 of us left in the state. So Leslie Shellcross in Fairbanks, and I'm in Southeast, but either one of us, if you contact Cooperative Extension, they will send your question to us if it has to do with canning. Can I sell this? So we just talked about that. And because that's why I got into food entrepreneurship. I started with food preservation as an extension agent. Quickly, the next, someone has a really great barbecue sauce that we've, worked on getting a tested recipe for them. And then they're like, everybody loves it. Can I sell it? That would be one of the next questions. And so that's why it was an easy transition into food entrepreneurship. But I'm a resource for that. DEC is a resource for that. I gave information in the last presentation about that. And then recommending books or websites. So if you are looking to find out if, Uncle Joe's pickled, zucchini or something like that, if that is a recipe that is safe for you to can, as opposed to just put in the fridge, if it's safe for you to can, you can compare it to the recipes at National Center for Home Food Preservation. Ball is a great resource. They do their own testing of high acid canning recipes. They include low acid canning recipes, but all of the low acid canning recipes were tested through Cooperative Extension and other institutions. Ball just tests high acid food recipes, but they will include these ones, but those are tested by other organizations. But Ball is great. USDA, Extension. If you can even just, home canned pickled zucchini Extension, if you're doing the web search. And then all of the extension offices across the nation that have tested recipes for pickling zucchini and canning it, you'll get those to come up. Hopefully UAFs will come up. But if something is in print, I typically say, if it is less than 5 years old, you're probably okay. You still might want to, but if it's in print, also be careful, because there's lots of stuff in print now that actually doesn't follow tested recipes. But if it is from one of these sources and it's in print, I'd look it up because things do change. For example, Ball has been doing some amazing testing related to apples, and they're discovering that just like tomatoes, apples are, because of how they're being bred so that they ship, et cetera, apples are coming down in acidity. And there are actually some of Ball's previous recipes, they're discovering that it's on that line. And right now I'm saying 5 years. We used to say 10 years, but things are actually being tested. So I'm saying if it's print, make sure that it's less than 5 years old. If it's more than that, just compare it to what's online, because everything's online with these organizations, all free online. Thank you all. Thank you all so much for coming.